From the late 1970s to the mid-1980s, many companies that would go on to become famous game developers and publishers got their start as computer hardware and software retail stores all across Japan. One of these companies, though, never quite achieved the success of their peers, but instead became a beloved cult developer, with titles that would start simply and go on to push the envelope of what was technically possible with contemporary machines. This would shift from an early exploitation title involving current events to eventually creating more mature psychological horror titles, stories less about shocks or scares, and more about an encroaching feeling of dread. A family business with a founder from a completely unexpected career field, with an incredibly talented musician's son, they would create multiple series with a unique blend of showmanship and technical skill that would leave a mark on those who played their games and become a significant influence on horror titles from future generations of developers. This is the story of Soft Studio Wing. The founder of Soft Studio Wing, Haruki Takeda, had a bit of a fascinating backstory. He used to be in a folk enka band. This is oversimplifying it a bit, but enka is a style of Japanese music which is sort of like a mixture of folk and traditional ballads with some Western influences. Takeda would eventually move on from his music career to running a business in Oita Prefecture. This store would have several iterations. It started out as a radio-controlled model shop. It would later change its business model to a coffee shop. And when Space Invaders became popular in the late 1970s, it would become an Invader House, a hybrid Space Invaders arcade and coffee bar. Finally, as that trend died down, RAM became an electronics store, and eventually a software development company on top of that. Takeda's past experience as a musician allowed him to produce the music for his games in-house. His son, Masaharu, who worked with him in the shop, was also a talented musician in his own right and would act as composer on some of the titles. Takeda got the idea of developing horror titles from the sounds of the Space Invaders machines going off in RAM late at night. They creeped him out, and he thought that the ideas circulating in his head from that would make for interesting stories. Studio Wing started out with some simple games. The first, Zombie House, was an action game where you guide a character across multiple screens dealing with traps and monsters. It has a high difficulty and a bit of a sense of humor about itself, as you can see. This was followed up by two simple adventure games, Galactic Warrior Deimos and Clico Bombing. Deimos is unfortunately lost media, but was a simple text and graphics adventure game about stopping space pirates. Clico Bombing, on the other hand, had a bit of a controversy around it. At the time of its development, public outrage had grown over the police's handling of a high-profile case that initially involved the kidnapping of Katsuhisa Izaki, an executive from the confectionery mega-company Glico. After Izaki managed to free himself and escape, the criminals responsible began sending letters to police and press all across Japan where they called themselves the Monster with 21 Faces. In these letters, they threatened to place poisoned candy on store shelves. At the time of Glico Bombing's development, nothing serious had yet been found, but, towards the end of the year, poisoned and labeled products from another food company, Morinaga, had been found in stores. The growing seriousness of the controversy would cause elements of the game to be reworked, and when Soft Studio Wing released it nationally, the game was a little different with more satirical and exploitative elements, and was retitled either Mariko Threat or Mariko Threatening Case, depending on where it was sold. A growing fear and distaste of the subject matter would cause low sales for this game, but it did give Soft Studio Wing enough notoriety that it drew attention to itself, and from that new attention, a team began to form. Joining the Takedas would be Haruhiko Sono, an employee at a local eyeglass shop who hung out at Wing due to a mutual interest in psychic powers and the occult. Haruhiko would compose and arrange music for some of the games, eventually becoming lead writer on some of them, as well as performing extensive occult research on all of the titles. Rounding out the team would be another musician, Hiroyuki Kitahara, an employee at a local printing shop, who would also contribute compositions and act as an insert character for some of the titles. From this, a team began to form. Haruki Takeda would be the author and scenario designer, Haruhiko Sono and Masaharu Takeda would contribute coding, music, and sound effects, and Hiroyuki Kitahara would work as art reference for the characters. Together with her cat Nyanta, and some other employees and regulars at RAM and neighboring shops who handled porting, package design, some programming, and playtesting, the staff at Studio Wing set out to make the sort of games that they would come to be known for, and it's with their first series, The Legend of White and Black, where the mood, atmosphere, and themes would begin to emerge. Also, they all claimed to be able to bend spoons, a fact that MSX Magazine would become absolutely obsessed with when doing a profile on them later on. One of the more unique things about Soft Studio Wing releases was that the music came packaged in a separate cassette tape along with the software. Players would queue up the tape and play the music on a separate stereo when instructed by the game. Provided YouTube cooperates, I've included the music for each game that does this in the background while I'm talking about them. Legend of White and Black Volume 1 Hiyaki tells the story of Shiratori, and a team of investigators he comes to know as they look into supernatural incidents across Japan, as the spirits of the damned are intruding into the realm of the living. This would be a theme that Studio Wing would return to time and time again, elaborating on with each successive release, but it starts simple enough, with a phone call from Shiratori's boss. Shiratori is a reporter, and he's been assigned to cover a fire at a local mental hospital. When he gets there, though, he finds that the fire had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, as if it was an illusion, and that one of the patients has claimed to manifest it. This patient is led away by the police, but not before staring directly at Shiratori. Unsettled, Shiratori tries to drink it off in a bar, only to be accosted by the same mental patient later in the night. The next morning, when riding the train, he finds himself surrounded by academics and investigators, all with an interest in the occult, who have found themselves drawn to the same train. All of them and the train they are on are pulled into a nightmare world, and after escaping the increasingly distorted reality within the train itself, they must explore a strange dungeon, gather psychic tokens and learn extrasensory abilities, and defeat the man posing as a mental patient. In reality, an evil godlike being called Hiyaki, named after the Parade of 100 Demons from Japanese folklore, a malevolent being trying to bring about the end of the world. There's a couple of things that Studio Wing would eventually excel at that start here, particularly a slow burn that turns into a total nightmare as the game gets close to its end. Legend of White and Black Volume 2 Renee is a bit of a tonal break from the first game. This one concerns the Bermuda Triangle, the lost continent of Atlantis, and time travel, where the main characters must locate and navigate an ancient labyrinth and end up unstuck in time and dealing with Joan of Arc. While the horror elements would not be completely eliminated from this game, it is a Studio Wing game after all, they would be toned down considerably, and the game is reminiscent of later 1990s adventure games like Myst and the Journeyman Project. Perhaps thinking that they went too light with the previous title, Studio Wing would develop Legend of White and Black Volume 3 Asuka, with a much more intense emphasis on horror elements. Despite the efforts of the protagonists of the previous games, Japan is now a scorched hellscape, and Hiyaki has returned more powerful and dangerous than ever. Shiratori and his allies must fight him one last time and try to stop him forever. For this release, the list of menu commands has been greatly expanded, allowing more actions than just looking, thinking, moving, and listening. Also, given the change in tone, danger is constant. You can die much more frequently in this game. Volume 3 can be summed up as relentless, with no break from the surreal horror landscapes until the end. This would be the last game in the series released by Studio Wing exclusively for the MSX. There was a planned grand finale for the Legend of White and Black series, the Legend of White and Black Apocalypse, but it would eventually be changed into a series of spin-off titles, and some of those spin-off titles and spiritual sequels would actually go on to eclipse these early releases in popularity and acclaim. Before that would happen, they would release one more title for the MSX exclusively, and it's an unusual one. In a strange twist of fate, Takeda's eldest daughter would end up marrying the novelist Isao Hiura, who Takeda was a fan of. Takeda and his team decided to adapt one of his novels, Sunday Tea with Aliens. As you can see, this is quite a bit different tonally than the rest of the work by Studio Wing. And although there are cameos by characters from the Legend of White and Black series, including Hiaki, there's no dread here, just hijinks. Wing would change direction a bit here and start to pursue multi-platform releases, with titles now being developed for the PC-88 and FM7, in addition to the MSX. Also changing things up would be some new additions to the company and promotions. Yoko Matsubara, Sono's wife, a former shoujo manga artist and current children's book illustrator, joined the company to provide work on character drawings. Additionally, Hidetoki Atsuka, a longtime regular from when RAM was an Invader House, would be promoted and move from debugging to character design and graphics on other titles. Their first multi-platform release would be Makai Revenge, another spiritual horror game, this time telling the story of a professor and his assistant battling a demon in a Buddhist temple. Although technology had marched on to the point where a second tape was no longer necessary, the title would still come with the add-on music tape as a bonus. Makai Revenge is a short game, but it has a high difficulty. One of the quirks of these menu-based adventure games is that it's sometimes difficult to know what option to select and how many times to select it, leading to having to perform a very esoteric series of actions in order for the story to progress. On the other hand, the improved graphics and design increase the surreal atmosphere. Wing would continue their multi-platform releases with a spin-off of the Legend of White and Black series, Hado no Hiyoteki. This game tells the story of a reporter named Shiro Kusanagi, who after being warned by a fortune-teller after stumbling home drunk from a bar, finds himself investigating a mass psychosis incident wherein members of a cult have all turned on each other violently. His investigations will introduce him to a psychic detective, Murakami, as well as other powerful individuals with supernatural abilities, and take him through both Japan and Vietnam. As you can see, there is another increase in art quality here, this time led by Atsuka, but this game is a little bit different tonally than other releases. It has a much more exploitative tone, with a great deal of gore and some elements of nudity and sexuality, about equivalent to a hard R-rated film. The command list remains expanded, the game runs snappily, and there are multiple endings. It's with their next release, though, that everything would coalesce into what is commonly regarded as this studio's greatest work. Released in the fall of 1988, Onryo Senki tells the story of Hiroyuki Kitahara, yes, that one, having horrific dreams of the end of the world. In the very beginning of the game, he finds that his dreams might be real, as he is attacked by a demonic creature. Right from the start, the jump in quality is felt. The music quality has skyrocketed. The mood is intense and oppressive. The dread is palpable, and while parts of this game have become dated or slightly cheesy, other sections of the game are still scary as hell. Over the length of the game, supernatural events grow in number, and one of the game's best uses of atmosphere is that a lot of the time early on, you'll see something out of the corner of your eye only for it to vanish, and for you to question yourself. Only for that same thing you thought you saw to come back later in full force. This keeps building and building until the final section of the game is basically hell on Earth. This is the game where everyone mentioned so far would collaborate, with Yoko Matsubara leading the designs. From this, they were able to achieve their strongest work. Wing's games have never been better than they were here, consistently giving you a sense of unease. It's also got rather brutal copy protection, a complex map made in response to a competitor at another store teasing Takeda about piracy. Onryo Senki is enormous, about 7 floppies on the PC-88 version, and is probably at the top of my own personal list of things that I wish had a fan translation. It also has one of the best marketing gimmicks or software pack-ins that I can think of. It came with a kamafuda, sort of a paper amulet for warding spirits, that the player was instructed to keep on them so that no spirits would attack them personally while playing the game. Wing would return to the Legend of White and Black series one last time with the Destruction games, a reboot of the series split across 2 releases. Shiratori and his team return, but this time around they are dealing with an event where a massive crowd witnessed Hyaki in the sky, and subsequently woke up the next day bleeding from the mouth and suddenly having psychic powers. While the game would initially stick to the formula that Wing had been following, they would experiment a little more here, with combat and dungeon crawling elements. Unfortunately, this experiment wasn't as successful, and while the first half was well received, the second half, which focused more on fighting and dungeon crawling, was not. Terrible bugs on Volume 2 which caused sound not to play on everything but a PC-88 VA, and complex mazes that no one liked wouldn't help either, and both contemporary and modern fan sites note these as weaker releases. There are less command options, the graphics have gone back in quality a little, and the game just feels scaled back. Due to these factors, this would be the last release of Legend of White and Black for these systems. Another atypical release was Makuden. While this game has supernatural elements like Wing's previous series, this is a puzzle game. 8 jewels are hidden in dungeons below a temple, and the player must guide a priest through them, solving puzzles and pushing blocks. The game is highly difficult, with some of the rooms being very tricky to traverse. As you can see, all of these games share themes of supernatural encroachment on a modern world. But their final major release took things in a very unexpected direction by asking the question, what if all this happened to Depeche Mode? Welcome to Mirrors, one of the only CD-ROM games for the PC-88 and the only Studio Wing release with a fan translation. The manager of the band Elenovision has been murdered right before the start of the tour, and lead singer David Astley is plagued by nightmares. He'll find himself slipping between worlds as things beyond our understanding begin to creep into our reality. As he continues to dream of a being calling himself the King of the North, more and more inexplicable things begin to occur throughout the tour. Mirrors is an extremely technically demanding game on the PC-88, and the fan translation had to pull some trickery to make the game work properly, which can slow it down a bit further. This can be a little frustrating, but it's never insurmountable. Mirrors returns to the strengths of the previous games, and it being a CD-ROM game allows for some truly excellent music and visuals, especially for 1990. The setting is interesting, with names and character designs derived from 80s bands and film actors, such as the members of Depeche Mode and Duran Duran, as well as contemporary actors such as Natasha Kinski. Character voices are distinct and strong, the pacing is back to being a steady, slow burn, and a B-plot where a police officer and his assistant follow the band around offers some much-needed comic relief in later moments. While the game has scaled back the number of commands tremendously, it still manages to have multiple paths and endings with an unlockable true ending. There would be one final Studio Wing release during this time, but oddly, it's not a horror game. Derived from Takeda's F1 racing obsession, this is a racing management simulator called Constructors Grand Prix. It's fairly standard for this sort of thing, with car customization, driver recruitment, and pit crew management. But there's no driving or simulation elements here, it's purely about the business of running a racing team. I imagine Soft Studio Wing was trying to diversify here, but unfortunately this game wasn't received well commercially or critically, and would be the end of major new software releases for the company. As the 90s began, a string of bad luck struck Soft Studio Wing. In addition to Destruction's sound bug, Mirrors also didn't sell well, partly because it was a CD-ROM for the PC-88 and not its much more powerful successor, the PC-98. Also, there was a rather baffling decision to port that game to the FM Towns instead of the PC-98. The FM Towns version is very good, with increased graphics and improved sound, but it loses some text and the true ending. Software company Fujicom would step in at this point and try to help with ports, moving Studio Wing to Tokyo, which unfortunately had the side effect of misplacing some of the team. This would also run into some issues. A high-budget port of Onryo Senki for the PC engine would not turn out as well as hoped. Although digitized graphics and expensive and famous voice actors were brought in to improve presentation, the redone illustrations made the game lose a lot of its bite, and the replacement of the game's original ambient soundtrack with the more funk-based one also watered down the horror elements. Now in significant financial trouble, Wing would scale back with one final port of Onryo Senki for Windows 95. A sound novel which you can control menu options with your voice. After that, though, they would shut down. But not forever. In 1999, Haruki Takeda and Son reopened in Oita under the name Takeda Keikaku, but still releasing under the Studio Wing brand name, as a small indie developer. They would negotiate some re-releases on Project Egg of their catalog, start work on Onryo Senki 2, and manage to release a digital magazine with ads and demos of their games. Some of the software on that disc is notable. Came out in about 2004. One game was a flash port of The Legend of White and Black Hiyaki. Another was a small game called Detective Murakami, which starred a supporting character from Hado no Target. Detective Murakami is an unusual game in that it looks like it was drawn in Microsoft Paint, but the music is absolute fire. It's essentially a joke game, but it has its fans. Also on the disc was another Onryo Senki spin-off, Onryo Senki Gaiden, which told the story of a haunted village. This was to be an episodic release previewing Onryo Senki 2. Unfortunately, though, only the first episode came out, and Onryo Senki 2 would never finish development. Studio Wing would eventually have to move in 2004 due to rent concerns, and during that process, Haruki Takeda would fall ill. He passed away in 2007, and Wing would lie dormant for another decade. In early 2018, a blog would show up authored by Masaharu, who had previously gone on to a different career being a music sequencer for games, the most notable I could find being Mario Kart 64. On his blog, he talked about repairing bugs on the digital releases of the games, released soundtracks and remixes of the music of the games, and rescued, fixed, and distributed some of the downloads from the Takeda Keikaku days. He would also start work on another Onryo Senki title, Onryo Senki 0. As of the recording of this video, Masaharu is still at it. In January of 2023, on his last blog post, he he mentions that he is still working on porting the MSX2 version of Hado no Hyoteki to Project Egg. Additionally, he's working through the legal considerations of porting Mirrors, which has the celebrity likeness issue, and Sunday Tea with Aliens due to certain rights belonging to the author. He also mentions that he's not feeling well, but once he's up to it again, development on other projects such as Onryo Senki 0 will resume. Studio Wing was a developer that stuck to its guns and to its fan base. In an interview conducted in 2004 when a fan visited the Takedas to see the then in development Onryo Senki 2, Takeda stated that it would have been easier and more profitable to fall into trends and develop what is popular. But if they did that, they wouldn't be Studio Wing. In a way, it seemed like Wing was always ahead of the curve a little bit. Horror games developed before the Japanese horror boom would make the genre incredibly powerful worldwide. CD-ROM adventure games 3 years before Myst would explode them in popularity. Smaller indie games before platforms like Steam and Itch would give them massive distribution. They had a very distinct voice, and that voice echoes in more modern releases. You can see elements of Studio Wing in its more famous successors. The general tone and atmosphere is replicated in the Fatal Frame games. The ideas of a normal world being encroached upon, and the game becoming more hellish as it progresses, are staples of the Silent Hill series. I hope that at some point Wing will resurrect again, that we'll see another title in the Onryo Senki series, or more fan translations, and that they will regain their place as a talented cult developer. Until then, see you next time.